Outstanding. Hey, thanks so much. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us here. I'll just give you a really brief intro of myself so you know who's talking to you tonight, and then we'll dive right in. Quick background on my career history. I started my career by graduating from West Point with a degree in engineering. Spent 5.5 years as an active duty infantry officer in the U.S. Army. After that, I got out, pursued an MBA program as a way to catalyze my career change into the private sector, into business, technology, and sales. And since then, I've been leading high performance teams. And so it's a great privilege to be the Chief Revenue Officer now here at Cherry. I've been here for right around 2 years. And during that period, I've learned a ton from practices like yourself as we've helped these practices achieve their goals by leveraging payment plan technologies to do so. And we've done that with thousands and thousands of practices. So we've really learned a lot alongside you, and I'm really excited to share our learnings with you here this evening. And ultimately, in a nutshell, what we've learned are the following 3 things. And this is really the agenda that we'll focus on here during this session. Number 1 is that consumers ultimately do expect payment plan options nowadays, right? They've been primed through other channels. They're consumers in their day lives and in their evenings when they're not your patients, and they are expecting payment plans at checkout. So we're going to talk through the trends that we're seeing on that side of the industry. Number 2, not all financing options are equal. So we're going to go through the pitfalls, the watchouts, the questions that you should be asking your either current or prospective payment plan or financing providers, because there's some really important things that I do want you to know, and you'll leave more educated about this topic for sure. And then the third thing we'll talk about are the results that you can expect by leveraging payment plan technology in the right way in your practice, and that's by supercharging your case acceptance. So not only getting patients to accept those great high quality treatments that you're offering, but also to increase the full case and optimal case acceptance. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing I like to do, just so I can understand the audience a little bit better, is please participate in this poll for me. So you're going to see a poll pop up on your screen, and my ask is that everyone answer. We'll share the results anonymously, and by doing these polls, you'll make the session much more valuable for one another, because I always think there's so much that we can learn from one another in these sessions, right? A lot of brain power out there. So please, let's answer the first poll. Is what type of patient financing do you currently offer at your practice? Could be an external third-party payment plan financing company. That's probably the most common scenario if you have financing or payment plans. Could be in-house financing. It could be both, or it could be neither. Maybe you don't offer any financing or payment plans in your practice, but please answer. We'll leave this open here for just a couple seconds. Click on your answer, and then we'll understand the audience a little bit better. Awesome. Well, thank you. We got the polls in already. So we've got about 38% that are offering an external or third-party payment plan option. We got about 20% that are doing in-house financing, which is great. 29% are actually doing both in-house and external financing and payment plan, and then about 13% have no option in the practice. So thanks so much for participating, and there'll be a few more polls to get some collective wisdom here. And then just one more of them will be right now, actually. So most of you do offer, all of you except for 13% offer some sort of payment plan option at your practice. And my question for you is, what does that out-of-pocket treatment cost generally need to be for you to bring up financing to a patient? So again, we'll leave this open for just a couple seconds. Choose the answer that you think most closely represents what you do at your practice. What does the treatment cost generally need to be for you to bring up financing to a patient? All right, very good, very good. So it looks like maybe 21% don't have a minimum, so you're presenting payment options to everyone. I think that's actually a really good practice, and I'll explain why here in a minute. And then there's kind of a mix of anywhere from 500 to 3,000, right? So we'll talk through that. And actually, the next slide that I have is going to explain a little bit more about really why you should be presenting these options to all of your patients. And this is why, right? And this is pretty recent. These are recent studies and stats that are from the Motley Fool and Fortune. But 47% of Americans can't handle a $500 emergency without worry. And so that means if you're presenting a case that has that much out-of-pocket expense to a patient, it's causing a lot of stress and worry, right? And I think there's a way that you can use payment plan technology to help overcome that and make that more affordable. And if you up that dollar amount to $1,000, then the clear majority, 57% of Americans, can't afford that expense, and that's what they're saying. So there's definitely a need to figure out how to make these treatments and cases that are very important more affordable. And again, we've, in our line of business, we've had an opportunity to learn about these practice goals from thousands of practices like yourselves. And these are the goals that we hear the most often, right? So you may resonate with all three of these, maybe just one of these three, but these are the three goals that payment plans can usually help you solve in your practice. Number one is treat more patients, increase that case acceptance rate. We're going to talk about that towards the end of the program here today. Number two, treating full cases. So again, getting those treatments to optimal, or getting those patients to optimal treatment that we know that they need for their oral health. And then number three, retaining great patients, right? Offering, and we hear this more and more from practices, offering more fee-for-service, more cash pay, more elective, maybe more cosmetic treatments. And that's definitely a growing trend. There's more practices doing that. Payment plans are also a great way to retain great patients and giving them those options. There's more of a demand for those types of services as well. So all three of these goals are great goals to have for a practice, and payment plans can help you get there. And the reason that payment plans are important is also because of this stat, right? 24% of adults went without some form of medical care because they could not pay. This is actually from the Federal Reserve, a study from last May. And unfortunately, dental care was the most frequently skipped, which is obviously disheartening for us all to hear, right? But on the silver lining is that there's an opportunity here, right? By making sure that you provide options to make those treatments, those great treatments that you provide, more affordable. There's a great opportunity here to move the needle, because these are treatments that unfortunately Americans are foregoing for other things, because again, it's cost, right? And the cost is a barrier kind of on three stages of your patient life cycle, if you will, right? It's a barrier at the acquisition stage. There could be patients that are out there that are just not even coming in as patients for hygiene or whatever, because they just don't think that they can afford what's coming next, right? So that's fewer patients coming through the door to begin with. It happens at conversion, where maybe your treatment coordinators are doing a great job consulting and explaining the importance of the treatment, and you're doing the same thing with those patients. But because there's not the right payment options presented, the affordability just isn't there for those patients. And that could be, that in and of itself typically is the main driver to a low case acceptance rate. And I've got some data on that we'll talk through here today. And then the third piece is retention, right? So patients might not come back because of costs. Again, they're worried about what's coming next, and they're going to spend those dollars elsewhere, right? And again, on the retention side, I think is where those elective treatments can sometimes come in as well, and payment plans are there to help. So the question is if they're not, if those dollars are not getting spent with your practice on those treatments that we know those patients need, where are those dollars going? This is where those dollars are going, right? They're going on discretionary spend on payment plans, and that's where consumers are spending their dollars these days. And in fact, this is a huge and growing part of the market. Consumers more and more are expecting payment plan options out there. And if you actually just look around yourself, whether it's tonight, when you're browsing online, maybe on Amazon or Apple or whatnot, just look around. Every time you hit a checkout page, they're going to show you the full sticker price of that item, and right next to it is going to be a monthly dollar amount. It's like everywhere online, and the reason they're doing that is because it works, and I'll share some data on that here in a second. But you see, at Apple, right, there's a $1,296 iPhone, but the more digestible number is right next to it at $54 a month, right? And even the bottom one on Amazon, right, even an $800 purchase is going to be presented as a $44 per month option for 18 months, right? So consumers, use those things, they see those things, and it's a huge growing part of how consumers these days are just paying for discretionary spend, right? So what that means is that folks more and more are budgeting themselves on a monthly basis, right? It's the monthly payment that makes sense to them more so than the full sticker price, right? It's about what they can fit into that monthly budget. And that's really important to make sure that you're quoting price in a way that more and more consumers can understand and digest. And again, we talked about the iPhone example already. And this is obviously a premium company that does premium branding and has premium products, and they're offering payment plans in this way, right? So there's no stigma to doing this. Like, everybody is doing that, right? And the reason they're doing that is because that's what consumers do expect. And there's been a ton of studies on this, but for folks that present price in this way, and what I mean is the full dollar amount right next to a monthly payment dollar amount, typically we'll see a 20 to 30% lift in conversion rate and a 30 to 50% lift in average ticket size. And there's quite a bit of studies around this. The one that I'm citing here is, I think, an RBC Capital study that was kind of explained by CNBC. But this is a phenomenon that just simply works, and that's why you see it everywhere, right? These companies have figured out that this is how they can increase their conversion rates and increase their average ticket size. Now, what we'll talk about in a second is the technology to do this in e-commerce, of course, is very different than doing it in your practice. But I think the point here is that these consumers are your patients, right? And this is really effective, an effective way for them to digest price and budget on a monthly basis. So obviously the parallels to your practice are, instead of a conversion rate, we're talking about an increase in case acceptance. And instead of the average ticket size, we're talking about optimal case acceptance, right? Getting the full treatment done for their oral health or whatever you're recommending to them. Another example, obviously, Peloton was a pioneer in using payment plans to really turbocharge their growth, right? $2,695 for the full bike and all the essentials that come with it, or it's as low as $63 a month, right? That makes it more digestible and affordable, and they do that. And they see a huge increase in conversion and average ticket size, and it's been very effective for them. So again, but the takeaway here that I do want to really hammer home is this is effective not by just saying, oh, we offer financing, or someone tries to escape from their Chrome browser window and they get a pop-up saying, oh, we actually offer financing. It's not a last-ditch effort. It's presented as a part of the product, as a part of the process, right? And they're quoting price next to the full sticker price and a monthly payment alongside one another. And that's really where that's most effective. So the learning here, I think, as we think about how this applies to your practice and how you can leverage that trend in consumer spend, is who is presenting treatment plan costs to the patient, and how does that conversation sound, right? How to make it sound in a way that these consumers and these patients understand. And I think what's really critical, and we'll talk about this more, is making sure that patients are aware of payment options before the case is presented, right? And it's not just a last-ditch effort to overcome kind of an objection around price. And for those of you, again, offering elective, cosmetic, maybe fee-for-service or cash pay treatments, this really can be a part of the marketing strategy for those treatments, right? And this is what it can look like. Right, again, quoting that full dollar amount as the monthly price, to the extent that you do, advertise the price in any way, or however the price is communicated, whether that's orally or in marketing materials or whatever. All right. So we'll move into the next section, which is not all financing options are equal. And I'm going to talk through with you some of the some of all of the different features and pitfalls that you need to be aware of when you're evaluating financing options for your practice. But before we do that, I would love to hear from you. Most of you, around 90% of you, are offering financing. So my question for you is, when you're deciding which financing provider you offer as your first choice to patients, what is the number one criteria you care the most about when you figure out, or when you decide who you're actually offering it to patients, or which provider you're offering to patients? And again, I think all of these are actually important, But if you had to pick one, please pick one that's the most important to you. We'll keep it open for just a few seconds. Just pick again the one that you think is the most important, obviously knowing that all of these do matter. All right. Pretty even split. And it's probably a function of all of these actually being important, like I was saying, and I'll explain why all of them are important. But high patient approval rates does seem to be the most important for this group. 44% said that. And that's I agree that that's important. We'll talk about that. Approval amounts, obviously important to a number of you. Low merchant fees, important to about 20% of you. And then patient-facing APR and interest rate, important. So a pretty even split, but it seems like the room generally thinks high patient approval rates is actually the most important. And that makes sense. You know, you're in the business of getting these patients treated and you want to get them approved. And I understand that. All right. So what are the questions that you should be asking or potentially think about asking your current or prospective financing or payment plan provider? There's a lot of questions that I think are really important here. Obviously, many of you already keyed in on approval rate, right? So how many patients are going to be approved and can now afford our treatments here? Merchant fees are important. Some of you agree with that, obviously. How much am I going to be paying to offer financing? Are there upfront? Are there recurring fixed costs associated with it? The patient experience, I think, is extremely important. You know, how does it reflect back on my practice when this patient is dealing with this third-party company that I've introduced them to? Are patients satisfied with their, obviously, with their treatment that you're providing? And you have a ton of pride for what you're doing in terms of quality treatment, right? And so you want to have that same level of pride for the care that your patient is getting from that financing company as well. Support, who do I call when I have questions? Are they going to answer the phone when I call and I have a patient standing right in front of me with a question, right? That's important. Plan length, 0% terms and that sort of thing are really important. We'll spend some time on that. And then lastly, your success as a practice with that payment plan offering, right? Are you going to get the training and support that you need, the talk track training for your staff and that sort of thing, so that you can actually leverage the tool to increase that case acceptance? And then there's stuff that's important to patients too. And these are the types of questions that those of you that are offering financing are probably already getting from patients. And it means that they're important things for those patients, right? When they're deciding whether or not to pursue the treatment plan that you're presenting and using financing as a way to do that. So am I going to get approved? Do I need to have a certain credit score? Is there interest or is there 0%? You know, is there retroactive or deferred interest? We're going to spend some time on that one today. How long do I have to pay this off? You know, what's the duration options there? Is it a credit card that I have to wait in the mail? Do I have to bring a credit card with me, another piece of plastic to carry around? And credit checks, probably the most important thing actually, based on our interactions with patients, right? Is like, is this going to impact my credit score by applying to see how much I can get approved for? All these are important questions here. We're going to dig into a few of them. And the first thing that we'll spend some time on here is interest rates. So obviously 0% interest-free financing is when there's no interest when payments are made on time. And obviously that's a good thing when it's truly 0%, because that helps minimize that financial burden on the patient. And it really does genuinely allow them to pay something off over time without incurring financial hardship or lump sum surprise interest payments and that sort of thing. There are some products out there, even those with 0%, that impose deferred interest on patients. And we're going to go into that in great detail. The other thing that's really important to understand too is there's always a lot of focus on 0% and that sort of thing. A lot of companies do offer 0%, but not all patients are going to qualify for 0% financing, even with best-in-class providers, right? So it's really important to understand what your provider does with those folks, because some will just disapprove them entirely. Others will potentially provide approvals to those, maybe lower amounts or higher merchant fees. But the reality is that's actually a pretty big chunk of patients out there, right? And so, yes, key in on the 0%, but also key in on, hey, what are the patients going to see when they're not going to get approved for 0%? And are those patients even going to get approved in the first place? And I think you're going to want them to get approved, right? So that you can treat them. and you'll want them to have an option. And while we're talking about this too, I think one thing that's really important to note that there's actually a lot of scrutiny happening in this kind of general industry right now, in particular around medical credit cards, right? So like specialty credit cards that are medical in nature. We've got several federal agencies looking into this right now. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau definitely is. I'll go through some of their most recent white paper that they published in May here next. And just look at the headlines of what you see out there, right? Medical credit cards targeted by US for piling debt onto patients. CFPB and HHS are doing inquiry into costly credit cards and loans pushed onto patients for healthcare costs. High-cost medical credit cards are a growing problem. Here's what you should know. And I spent a lot of time reading through these things. And when you peel back the onion and you read through these, it all comes down to one thing. It's not really the credit card necessarily, it's the deferred interest. Like that is what these agencies are keying in on. And so I do want to spend some time making sure that we go through the implications of what deferred interest does to a patient downstream, right? It's deferred interest that these agencies are really keying in on here. And so this is the source, and I've got a few slides from this source because there's some really great content here. But the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put out a white paper just in May, a couple months ago, narrowing in on specifically the practice of deferred interest. And again, medical credit cards are cited, but it's like really it's the deferred interest piece that gets the attention here. And their argument is that those products are typically more expensive than other forms of payment due to the higher interest payments. And again, these are products that are presented as no interest if paid in full, right? So you think that it's really a 0% product, and part of it is, but the reality is that for many consumers, it's actually more expensive than an interest-bearing product. And in some cases, in many cases, more expensive than even a regular credit card. So it can be really damaging to a patient's financial condition here. And how expensive can those products really be? Well, if and this again, I'm citing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau here, where they say the typical medical credit card interest or APR interest rate is 26.99%, and the mean APR for all general purpose credit cards is approximately 16%. I will say, even though this was published in May of 2023, it was citing last year's data, so that is about a year old. I would say that those numbers are actually higher. In particular, I know that general purpose credit cards are actually north of 20% now, probably like 20 to 22%, just because of the rising interest rate environment. But the point still stands that those medical credit cards are actually way higher, right? And the second stat is really staggering also, which is, between 2018 and 2020, 20% of healthcare purchases resulted in deferred interest being assessed. So 1 out of 5 folks that are using one of those medical credit cards that has deferred interest as an opportunity are actually getting hit with the deferred interest, right? That's actually a lot. So 1 of 5 of your patients that could be using a medical credit card. And in 2020, the total cost of deferred interest for those who ultimately were assessed interest was 23% of the initial dollar volume. And that's actually a lot of money. If you think about the average treatment costs that you're presenting to patients, 1 out of 5 of those patients who use a medical credit card getting hit by that actual deferred interest, so they're not really getting the benefit out of 0%. What happens is that full amount, regardless of how much they paid off, actually gets assessed with that APR of, in this example, 26.99%. So the reason it's less than 26.99% is that patient could get set up with no interest if paid in full for 6 months, right? And if it's not paid in full, and I mean full, then that will be assessed. That interest rate will be assessed on, in that scenario, maybe 6 months, it could be 12 months, it could be 24 months, right? But on average, it was a 23% assessment of the initial purchase size, not just the balance remaining, the initial purchase size. And that's where the rubber really meets the road with deferred interest. And so just to kind of hammer home with an example here, right? So let's say that a root canal and a crown costs the patient $2,400, right? And the patient uses a medical credit card with a 6-month promotional deferred interest period, right? No interest if paid in full for 6 months, right? So they'll, in a perfect scenario, they pay $400 for each of the 6 months, and they incur no interest. But what if the full balance is not paid? Maybe they started their payments late. Maybe they missed just one of the 6 payments. Maybe they missed their last payment, or they didn't make any payments. Any of those scenarios means that interest will be assessed, and it will be based on the full initial purchase price, not how much balance is remaining, right? So if you do the math on that, this scenario, again, it's a 6-month scenario, right? Like they took the no interest paid in full for 6-month option that maybe they were presented with. That would be, based on my back of the napkin, right around $324 of deferred interest being assessed immediately at month 6. And it doesn't matter how much of it is left to pay off, right? And that is the revenue model of these folks that are offering deferred interest, right? And it's a hard thing for patients to digest. So let me move into the next poll question here. And my question for you is, for those of you who are offering financing or payment plans, how often or how common is it for your practice to later receive a complaint about their experience with that company? So it could be a customer service complaint or confusion related complaint, or maybe they were upset about being assessed that deferred interest charge that they didn't really understand. Just love to hear from the room, like how often does that kind of come back to your practice? Good, kind of a mixed bag. So some of you haven't received a complaint, or maybe not so far as you're aware, right? Some of you rarely receive complaints. That's good. Some of you are often receiving those complaints, sometimes, right? I think that those complaints are out there. And the reason I'm curious what the room thought about this is, like, we definitely have practices coming to our team saying, hey, we're getting a lot of complaints from this other company, right? And we need something different because of that. So it's an important dynamic. And really, I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that you're kind of tying your name, right, to who you're picking for your financing provider. And so you do want a quality provider that really provides white glove service to your patients, and who's not going to try to throw a gotcha in there at month 6 or month 12, right? And I think that that's really important, right? So we do, I anecdotally hear that there are complaints that are out there about some of the providers, and a lot of the times that does come back to the practice. And so really, you do want an affordable payment plan experience that can keep that same patient coming back. I know the data that we have internally is that right around like 30% of the loans that we fund are actually from repeat patients, which we're so excited about, right? That folks have a great experience. And I think that's really important, is patients that can keep coming back are retained patients for you too, right? And that's really important. So you do want to find a company to partner with in this area that can help you do that, and not be kind of an operational drag on your practice by bringing complaints into your door. And we kind of talked a little bit about this too, but there is a product type difference between a medical credit card. It's another piece of plastic to carry around, and you wait for it in the mail, et cetera, right? Or payment plans, which again is where the market is moving for sure on the consumer side. And there's just a higher expectation for buy now, pay later technology. But I think the last point is actually really interesting, and folks might not be completely aware of that payment plans are actually reported to credit bureaus as installments instead of revolving credit. And that can impact a patient's credit score by having an additional revolving credit. Usually it's a more negative impact to have additional line of revolving credit opened. Usually requires a hard credit check, for example, to open a new revolving credit line. So I think that that's actually an important dynamic too, that sometimes, and for most patients, it's actually a more credit score friendly thing to do, to open up an installment rather than a revolving credit line, which is like a kind of traditional medical credit card. And while we're talking about credit checks, a few more points that I can make here too, right? Obviously, a hard credit check versus a soft credit check is a really important question that you want to make sure you understand about your payment plan, your current or prospective payment plan provider, right? If somebody is doing a hard credit check on your patient, that does, just the check itself does negatively impact their credit score. A soft credit check does not impact someone's credit score. And I'll say that again. This might be a quiz question later, but yeah, soft credit checks do not affect a patient's credit score. All right, and it's really important because obviously you're there to treat patients, and you don't want to have to worry about these types of dynamics, right? For someone just to see if they're approved or qualified for the right amount. So that's really important. So hard versus soft credit checks, and the folks that do hard credit checks, maybe you can still get pre-approved without a hard credit check, but then they'll do a hard credit check before funding, and so you want to ask about that dynamic too. I think I would recommend looking for a partner that just doesn't do any hard credit checks at all, because that really does help protect those patient credit scores. And then there's a spectrum of kind of approval related claims. And in fact, many of you mentioned approval rates being among the most important things for your practice. But I always think of it as kind of a triangle, right? The different providers have kind of different claims about approval rates and approval amounts. And I would say, some providers out there have really high approval amounts, but low approval rates, which means that there's a big spectrum of patients that are just simply not going to get approved at all. And the way that they pay for those high approval amounts in many cases is with deferred interest, right? They claim to keep practice fees low and APRs low, but really it's deferred interest that's paying for that party. And that does have pretty negative downstream impacts for those patients. There's others out there that have high approval rates, but low approval amounts, right? So they'll approve almost anybody, but there'll be like a super high merchant fee. And it could be like a really high down payment. So you're paying a really high merchant fee on an approval that could be $200 to $500. And the reality is maybe only half of that is actually getting put on a payment plan because it's a really high down payment for the patient too. So it's a really important dynamic to understand how some of those things work. And then there's even companies out there that have like no practice fee, which sounds just great. There's no practice fee, but oftentimes what they'll do is they'll charge the patient like an origination fee or something like that. So I think it's really important to understand where your payment plan or what the right payment plan or financing provider can do for you here. But these are the types of questions that you can ask. And then, the last thing I'll say before we move into the case acceptance part of the session here is plan length. There's a lot of different, and let's say that you've narrowed it in on a financing provider, a payment plan provider that you think is a great fit for your practice. You're going to have to figure out how often do you want to, or I should say, how long do you want to offer 0% financing out to the patients that get approved for it. You can usually choose anything from 6 months out to 24 months. But it does come with a higher practice fee to obviously extend 0% out to 24 months. It's more expensive to do that for these payment plan companies, right? And you would need to choose that plan. But what we found is that sometimes that's actually well worth it, and it's a fit for many practices. So I would strongly consider offering 0% out to 12 to 24 months. We definitely see through our data that those practices tend to do more volume. And so they could result in happier patients and higher case acceptance. And we have some data that may suggest that. Separately, there's usually interest-bearing plans that some will provide out to 60 months too, right? So make sure you understand the plan length and you get a 0% offer that makes sense based on your average ticket size in your practice or what you're planning to focus on there. All right, so we'll move into the case acceptance. This is kind of the third and final section that we've got here today. And this is where, okay, now you've figured out that, hey, I need payment plans in my practice. I want to figure out how to actually implement them and leverage them to increase case acceptance. And that's what we'll talk about here. And what I'd like to do is start with a poll. Does your practice currently track your case acceptance rate? It's okay if you say no. I know there's a lot of practices that don't. I'm just curious how many of them are out there today. Obviously, we'll keep it anonymous, but please do answer because I'm curious. All right, about an even split. And I think that this is probably pretty representative, actually. We do find a good number of practices do track case acceptance as a performance metric for their practice, but many don't. And I think that that's certainly okay, but hopefully after this presentation, you can consider maybe tracking it, because I think there is some value there to track this metric. And we'll talk through why that is. I think what's really important for those of you who track it, you probably know what your case acceptance is, and I'm kind of curious what it is actually. But if you don't track it, or even if you do track it and you wonder what the averages are, here's the numbers, right? And this is from our friends over at Dental Intelligence, and they publish some industry benchmarks that are really interesting on some of these statistics. But according to their data, the US average for same day treatment dollar acceptance, 29%. So you present a case to a patient, and 29% of those dollars are accepted and booked, from that day. And most of those patients are walking out the door though, right? And if you look at overall treatment dollar acceptance, it's about 40%. So 40% of dollars on those cases, those treatment cases that you're presenting, are accepted, but the vast majority, so 60%, are never accepted. And I just think that that's just a travesty, right? Because these are important cases for those patients' oral health. You're out there offering really high quality treatments, and we want patients to get those treatments that they need, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for most practices to really improve this number. And I think that that's a key takeaway here, is that most practices, even if you're a well-run practice, has room for improvement on this metric, because so many of those possible cases are just walking out the door, right? And they're never getting the treatment that they need. And that's a really important thing, and it's a problem that's worth solving, right, for their health. And what's the most common reason not to accept? It's because of price. So 2/3 of the reason for 2/3 of those 60% not moving forward is because of price, right? It's price, right? And it kind of goes back to that first slide that I presented about basically half of Americans are super worried if they get hit with a $500 kind of unexpected cost, right? So there's a need to make some of these things more affordable for sure. And the reality is that most of these folks who don't move forward because of price, you'll never know why they aren't moving forward, right? You might never get really a reason from them, or they don't, it's embarrassing to say that they can't afford it and that sort of thing. But this is the reality, right? And again, our strong recommendation here, and there's a ton of data on the consumer research side to back this up, is that by showing monthly pricing next to full kind of case out-of-pocket costs, does result in an increase in treatment acceptance. So 25% increase in case acceptance from where it maybe was prior, and up to a 50% increase in treatment dollars, right? And this is kind of the analog of that earlier slide about how those companies saw an increase in conversion rates and average spend, right? Those e-commerce companies that are doing something. And so this is how that data really translates into our industry. All right, one more poll here. For those of you who are offering financing or payment plans, who typically handles that conversation with the patient at your practice? So again, I know that about 90% of you are offering something. So who's handling that conversation? Is it you? Is it the front desk? Is it the treatment coordinator? Pretty even split. So 27%, looks like the doctor is handling that. 35% front desk, 38% treatment coordinator, 0% other. So it's good that we had all the right answers in there in the question. So thanks for participating in that. Very good. And then one last poll question in this section, which is, again, for the 90% of you who are offering payment plans, when is it brought up? And this is a multi-select. So choose all of the options that apply to you. I think you should be able to do that on the poll question. So is it passively through materials that you're displaying in the office and you kind of just wait for the patient to ask for it maybe? Is it passively through appointment reminders, intake forms, or other digital ways, maybe on your website? Is it proactively by the office staff, such as during treatment plan presentation to the patient, or is it just reactively, like it's there, but only if the patient asks for it? And again, you can select multiple of these depending on what you all do. See the most common, so some passive stuff, and I think it's good to do it, really all of these things actually, but it looks like the most commonly selected option is proactively by the office staff. And I think that that's actually really important for the reasons that we discussed, and I'll even talk through a few more reasons why that's important. But it looks like many of you are savvy and you're already doing that. And the other one though is reactively when the patient asks for it. So again, I really would argue that if that's the only time it comes up, then it's actually probably too late, and it means you're probably missing quite a few patients who are just too embarrassed to ask for financing, right? So I would recommend that not be the only thing that you are doing. Obviously, if they ask for it, then of course you're going to talk about it. And really our recommendation, where we've seen the most practice success here on case acceptance, is figuring out ways to just kind of incorporate it into your practice operations, right? Get it in the work stream of your day-to-day practice operations, get it into that patient flow at your practice, right? It's a systematic approach to integrate it into your office, right? So that's making sure that all of your staff is trained to understand and communicate financing for payment plan options. That means even like doing role plays and how to like actually have a conversation with the patient that just feels natural and not awkward. And it's not that hard, but practicing it a couple times with someone like me or one of our staff members is really helpful. And we've actually seen a lot of success by just doing simple role plays like that, right? Just to practice the conversation. Utilizing marketing materials to drive awareness and conversation is really important. And really what that means is kind of a QR code by the front desk or in the reception area, right? Or something that the patient can see while they're in the chair too, right? And the idea is to kind of drive awareness and conversation. So again, they know that there's payment options out there, right? Because again, what you want to avoid is that emotional moment when the patient realizes, oh shoot, there's like a $2,000 expense here that I was not planning for, and I don't know what to pay, right? I don't know how I'm gonna pay for it, because this is a nerve-wracking moment for most Americans, let alone when they're right in front of you, right? So you don't want to have that point of emotional vulnerability. And the way to prevent that is by making sure that there's awareness of the payment plan or financing options before the case is presented. You want to establish a flow to incorporate financing into a more than one way, right? But there's some ideas here in terms of appointment booking or patient intake forms and consultations. My personal favorite on the patient intake forms, right, is you can have a question on your intake form, which is, are you aware that we offer payment plans or financing, right? So again, you get like kind of useless data from that, because it doesn't really matter if they select yes or no, but because they had to answer that question, they're aware of it now. And it's a point of conversation, right? Because when your staff or your treatment coordinator is talking to the patient, depending on what treatment they're looking at, you can say, hey, I saw that you weren't aware that we offered payment plans. Do you have any questions about X, Y, or Z company that we're offering, right? Or I saw that you are aware that we offer payment plans. Are you interested in learning more, right? So like no matter how they respond, it drives the conversation, and that is the point of that, right? And then ultimately you want to show empathy, and you're providing information and options to that patient. And that's really important. So again, incorporating it into your practice operations here is key. One of the things that I know that several dental practices are doing, and they swear this is a really successful way to improve that case acceptance rate, is to actually incentivize or commission their staff. Certainly, I don't think every dental practice is doing this, but I'm just curious, right? Do you have any staff members in your practice that are incentivized or commissioned on a performance metric like case acceptance, or maybe a related metric in your practice? So about 15% say yes, and 85% say no. I think this is something that is worth looking into. We do see more and more practices doing that in a right way, right? A patient-friendly way for treatment coordinators and those types of positions. But hey, thanks for answering that poll. Really appreciate that. So the last few slides here is, kind of just reiterating some of the points that I made, and then we're going to open it up for questions here in a few minutes. But ultimately, when you're offering financing, it's really important that you're offering it to every patient, right, to maximize case acceptance. Because remember, 60% of the cases that you're presenting to patients are not getting accepted, like ever. And that's, or I would say 60% of the dollars really is how that data point is worded. But that's like a lot. And so that means that there's a lot. So the majority of patients actually are not going to accept it, right? And so you really should be offering and spreading awareness financing to everyone, because you don't know who those patients are. And the second reason is that, like we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, people do budget on a monthly basis. That's where more and more of the consumer economy is moving, is to kind of monthly related payments and budgeting. And a large lump sum just doesn't really fit into that, right? Like, doesn't really, it's hard to do the mental math to understand if it's really affordable. And it certainly probably isn't for most Americans if it's just the full ticket cost that they're looking at. But monthly payments do, and monthly payments are digestible. And lastly, it's actually the most legally compliant thing to do anyway. It's a violation, for example, of fair lending compliance regulations and laws if you are only offering like financing to like people that look like they need it. There are certain people, you can't do that, right? So you do need to have kind of an even-handed approach of presenting it as an option to everyone if your practice does offer it. And so I think that's really important. And it's also just more effective, obviously, to offer it to every patient. And when should you offer financing? I think it's really important to present options early, right? It gives patients an opportunity to plan. It alleviates their stress. It plants seeds for case acceptance. So again, you don't want to have that emotional surprise of a huge ticket price without making sure that they are aware that there's options available. And it's reassuring for patients to have that awareness prior to the case acceptance. And ultimately, again, you're showing empathy by providing options, right? And that's really important because the dollar amounts that we're talking are scary to the vast majority of Americans. And here's what some of those things look like. Again, if you are working on increasing the fee-for-service treatments that you're offering, for example, I think using social media is a really powerful way to do that. We've seen a lot of success with practices that are doing that. If you're mainly focused on work that is not elective in nature, then the marketing push is probably a little bit less important for your office, but instead you'll make sure that you have materials in the office to drive the conversation. You could ask the question on the patient intake form that I discussed earlier, for example, right? So make sure that you're partnering with somebody that can help brainstorm with you the most effective way that you can provide these patient resources to make sure that patients are aware of the option. And then again, how do you do it? Present prices in terms of monthly numbers alongside the full ticket price. And that is the key. That's the key, is presenting prices in monthly numbers. I think the most effective way to do that is by providing like a payment estimator printout that visually displays the payment options, the full sticker price, right? And it breaks it down into monthly payments into like an easy chart of like a 6-month or a 12-month plan, for example. And then that allows patients to review that. It allows you to circle and kind of give them something that they can take home. Obviously, the goal is to try to get them to accept their treatment and get that same-day treatment acceptance. But ultimately, 25% of cases are going to be accepted after a patient leaves the office, right? So you want to make sure that they're going home with something that helps alleviate the number one objection, which is going to be cost. It's not going to be based on the quality of treatment or the fact that they need the treatment. It's going to be based on the costs, right? That's the objection that they're thinking about when they leave the office. So you want to make sure that they've got resources to help them through that. And then in terms of talk tracks, right? Like I talked about how important it is to maybe just do some simple role plays even with your staff, or have your partner do that for you with their staff, and how to talk through these things. But just simple things like, hey, we offer different payment options to split out your out-of-pocket expenses. You don't have to pay that full sticker price today. You can split the bill into easy monthly payments. We take cash, credit card, and payment plans to pay over time, which you prefer, right? So there's a lot of different ways to kind of bring up that conversation. All right. Well, hey, I think we do have, that's it. And we do have a couple minutes here to answer a few questions. So would love to get any questions if you have any. So there's a question about, why are payment plans any better than a credit card? It's actually a really good question. We get that quite a bit. I think there's several different reasons there. I think a lot of patients can get, a 0% option for, even true 0% option for 6 or 12 months or beyond, and they're certainly not getting that off their typical credit card. So it can be more financially friendly for that patient in that scenario. I think there are some folks that don't have a credit card, or they might not have a credit limit high enough for the treatment costs that you're presenting, right? And to go back to the credit card and request an increase in their line will almost always result in a hard credit check, right? So I think that's really important. And then I think one of the other reasons is it really sets someone off on a financially responsible way to pay something, because a payment plan does typically require the first installment to be paid at the time of purchase, right? So you're putting something on auto pay, they're making the first payment, which is the same amount as everything else. There's not a surprise, several hundred or God forbid $1,000 deferred interest payment at the end, and it's an easy way for a lot of folks to pay it off. And again, they're doing budgeting on a monthly basis anyway. Is there value in having multiple financing options? How do you determine which to use first? Yeah, I think that there can be value. I think that you can also kind of overwhelm the patients too, depending on how you're presenting them, right? If it's just kind of like, oh, here's our financing options, and you have like 5 brochures, it'd be kind of like equivalent to you saying, here's 5 different treatment options to treat your condition, but you pick it out, right? And it's just like overwhelming to make a choice like that. So I think it is really important to offer a specific recommended option that's first. Again, I think it's really important to make sure that you're steering the patient in like a healthy financial direction, right? So what I think is really important is offering an option that's not deferred interest heavy, right? Because it's easier to explain what the interest is. It's like less complicated. There's less gotchas that can come back to your staff if you have retroactive APR. But I think obviously the things to look at on who's going to be first look for your practice are, you're going to want to look at the fees, you're going to want to look at the approval rates, you want to look at whether or not there's deferred interest and what those patient-facing terms are, and that's what I would recommend. Great question there. There's a question around won't payment plans interfere if the patient decides not to go ahead with treatment after starting the payment? I think the key is to make sure that, the way that most payment plans work is that a patient would actually get pre-approved, and then you start the actual payment after they're approved, right? So you know how much they're approved for, and then you can run the payment. So it's usually not typical that someone would get like hung up. As long as they're getting pre-approved, you should be able to execute the transaction on that approval, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that answers your question there. All right, that's a wrap for today. But hey, thanks so much. It was a joy to work with all of you this evening, and have a great rest of the day.